Good morning, good evening, everyone. To every corner of the world today. It is a great pleasure to me to introduce and moderate that conversation between Professor Stephen Bronner and Professor Mehdi Zakarian. This initiative, let me say, that is organized to honoring and commemorating the 75th anniversary of United Nations, which will take place tomorrow, 21st October. And before to start, just let me briefly introduce the organization, International Council for Diplomacy and Dialogue. Is a non-political organization. It is composed from colleagues, academics, and activists from many disciplines: law, political sciences, history, and so on. Is a friendly environment, is an organization devoted to peace and justice through dialogue, but in an innovative way, because every one of us starts from a dialogue between civil societies. So the intent is to restore multilateralism from people, not from institutions, in a very innovative way. And we have currently many projects open in this sense, because after all, United Nations are every one of us. That's the idea. ICDD also promotes dialogue through conferences and webinars, and specialized advisor and proposing innovative way for dialogues, and that initiative is one of that. On the other side, also, let me just add that this initiative also includes, today, it is my privilege, include also FIDEM, which is like ICDD, a non-political organization, which include also academics and activists. And Professor Mehdi is the president of that organization. So today it is an important day also to join force between not only people, but also those two innovative organizations to promote dialogue and restore multilateralism in with the occasion of the anniversary of United Nations. So who is speaking now is someone, I used to define myself a privileged person, and to be here with all of you is one more evidence of that. I'm Antonietta Elia. I'm Senior Associate Fellow in Law at University of Santiago de Compostela, Spain, but I have also the privilege to be visiting professor of international human rights law at Inter-American Academy of Human Rights in Mexico. And I have also been candidate to the Italian seat of the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture. So, but most important, I'm vice director of ICDD with my fellow colleagues, and also the founder, Professor Stephen Bronner. Finally, just before to enter into the debate and the conversation, I would like very much to express my profound appreciation to my fellow colleagues of ICDD to organize also technically that meeting today, and especially Dr. Dan Jacobs, who has been fundamental in that organization. So let's go. Welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce to all of you Professor Stephen Bronner, who is, as I said, the co-founder of ICDD. He is a professor of emeritus professor at Rutgers University professor of political sciences, expert on human rights and international affairs. He has an extensive expertise and a list of books published about different topics, but most important is a person and professional devoted to peace and dialogue, and it is my privilege to have him as my fellow colleague. So Professor Mehdi Zakarian is, as I said, the president of FIDEM, Fédération internationale pour le dialogue. J'invite Professeur Mehdi à me corriger si je me trompe sur la définition française, pour le dialogue dans la Méditerranée. He is also associate professor of law and international relations. He has been visiting professor at Penn State in the US, and also to Paris Panthéon Assas. And he is specialized also in international affairs and security and human rights. But I don't want to. We need possibly a webinar just to list all important things both of our guests today did continuing to do for peace and justice. So going ahead and entering into the merit of that conversation, I would just to ask to our guests to consider that we will start with few questions. Everyone has between 5 and 7 minutes to answer to or present the views in relation to the question. I suggest and exhort all of you to exchange views, trying to carry out in a dynamic way the discussion. And if you want just to intervene, just let me know. And of course, as a moderator, I have the right to interrupt you and to be inside the discussion. But I promise I will try to not abuse of my privilege to be a moderator. I promise. So first question. Everyone can choose if want to start firstly or secondly. We are, as I said, at 75th anniversary of United Nations. So every anniversary is a moment to collect what it has been done and what should be do in the near future. And the same is for United Nations. So my first question for our guest, for both of you, is from your perspective, the first most important challenge United Nations must deal with starting from the day after tomorrow, so from 25th. What is the first most important challenge in your idea? Please, you have between 5 and 7 minutes. Stephen, would you like to start?
Sure. First of all, let me thank Mehdi for joining us, and thank you, Antoinetta, for your moderating skills. I think if you consider the UN at 75, first of all, it's not one single entity, and I think that's very important. We have, of course, the Security Council, which is limited, undemocratic, and basically Eurocentric, but which actually has power to make the most serious decisions. Then we have the General Assembly, often attacked as a just a talking body that does nothing. I think that's an enormous mistake. It allows for exchange of views. It allows for back channel diplomacy. It makes clear what global opinion is. And then finally, we have what I think is the most important element of the UN, which is its agencies. UNICEF, UNESCO, UNRWA, the World Health Organization. There are dozens of these. And to my mind, the most important thing today, especially after the Trump administration has so withdrawn funding, is to reinvigorate those agencies. An agency like UNRWA basically supported the Palestinians, and money was withdrawn. This has contributed mightily to the plight of Palestine. That's just an example. And so I believe that the reinvigoration of these agencies is perhaps the primary issue for dealing with any number of global crises, from climate change to peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia, to any number of issues going on in the world. I think I would also add one other thing. One has seen over time that the weaknesses of the United Nations is very much connected with the absorption of its members with national interests and fear of impinging upon their own sovereignty. This is why, for example, in the International Court isn't recognized in the United States. This is something where civil society can speak up and speak to better relations. Speak to empowerment of the UN. And this is a major publicity task that has to be undertaken in the future, or as you put it, Antonietta. And the last point I want to make is one of the things that the UN is for is precisely to create possibilities like we're seeing today, where we have somebody from the United States and somebody from Iran beginning to speak civilly and about important issues, that each of us is stretching out his hand to the other is a matter of enormous importance, given again the bellicose, xenophobic, or ultranationalist policies pursued by the Trump administration in my country, but also the Khamenei government in Tehran. Here is where we have to begin. We have to begin, as you put it, below, with civil society. Under these circumstances, that's the only way to confront the kind of tensions that exist between these countries.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for those very interesting points. And I will return on it soon after. And also thank you to be so timely. As I used to say, I always too much, a lot to learn also how to manage time. So thank you very much also for the Mehdi. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. First of all, let me to say hello to everyone. My sincere hellos to my colleague, Professor Bruni, and so to Professor Elia. I'm very happy to participate in this conversation, not a debate, because last night debate is finished between the Trump and Biden, but this is the conversation or dialogue between us. So
That's true, it's my fault.
Yeah, and so please let me to say that I was invited professor or visiting professor at Penn Law, not at Penn State University, at the University of Pennsylvania, Penn Law in Philadelphia, because Penn State University is different from the Pennsylvania University. Right. And so I was the visiting professor in Université Paris 2, Panthéon-Assas. About your question, I should say that from tomorrow, we need to change our goals and our view to the United Nations. I think United Nations based on the state-centered theory, and this is wrong. So if the United Nations would like to work with the theory of the state-centered, there will be a lot of problems, because we have the task to convince all of the states for the decision of the United Nations. And with this aim, we cannot arrive to a good result or to a good to a good achievement. This is the problem that United Nations have. I think, as Professor Bronner he mentioned it, I think we need to a global civil society. So if we have a global civil society, we can introduce or we can present the ideas of the NGOs, or maybe INGOs, I mean international non-governmental organizations, the idea of the notable peoples like professors, like experts of the human rights, experts of the security, experts of the environment. And so then we can have the idea of the transnational cooperation organization, like the large companies that they have very influence in our world. So if we look in the past years, 75 years, we had only the influence by states. Even after the 2000, the states, they tried to make a reform in the United Nations. And I think the reforms had not happened. It's stopped by the states. For example, look to the reforms we needed for the United Nations, like, for example, combating terrorism. It's not happened. Or reform on the human rights issue. Only they changed the name of the Commission of Human Rights to the Council of Human Rights. But in fact, they are the states, they decide in the Council of Human Rights. And if you look in the Council of the Human Rights, only the decisions are only political, not legally. For example, in the recent election in the Human Rights Council, the states are elected, which are not which don't have the good experience on the issue of the human rights, like Uzbekistan, China, or or even Pakistan. They are not the champion of the human rights, but they are elected as the member of the Human Rights Council, because it shows that United Nations is totally state-centered. So I think we need to change United Nations from the state-centered to the civil society, global civil society centered. This is the first things that we need.
Okay, thank you very much to both. Just a few comments about that, and before to ask the second question, strictly related to what all of you said respectively. So what I understand from both of you is that it's a basic need to apply and implement, and I'm really interested to have your opinion about that. Professor Mehdi Zakarian just underlined the need to have a change of the UN mood from state-centered to people-centered, nation-centered, if you want. And if I rightly understand, exactly like Professor Bronner did, saying that there is a need to reinvigorating agencies and to consider UN just not as a single entity, but composed as a system of agencies. But the idea is, are you sure that the Charter of United Nations, like we know it, has been implemented 75 years after? Just let me give you an example of what I'm trying to say. In relation to General Assembly that you already mentioned, you know that General Assembly is the forum of representation of members of United Nations, and especially it should have been, according to the same charter, the place of representation of all nations, not governments. But finally, the praxis demonstrated that, especially when there is an important decision or resolution, better said, to be assumed, including inside the General Assembly, who is appearing are the representative of states, of government. So, it is, in your idea, viable, possible, needed to apply, to understand in what, according to what you say, that Article 9 of Charter of United Nations must be strictly interpreted and applied for at least at level of subcommissions inside the General Assembly. Think, for example, just because Human Rights Council has been mentioned, think to Subcommission of Human Rights of the General Assembly. It is always composed by representative of states, special permanent representative. So what do you think? Is it viable, possible to change and switch at least to representative of parliaments of states, to have voices, to give voices to people of member states of United Nations, and have a step ahead in the process of change from state-centered to nation-centered and civil society-centered of address of United Nations? That's the first question. The second one, in relation specifically to Human Rights Council. Uh, I agree with Professor Zakarian that the Human Rights Council is a political instrument, and the idea was also to overcome the obstacle that the former Human Rights Commission of United Nations found in its work. But it also true that what is needed inside is major technical expertise, because the discourse of human rights it is not simply political, but is also a matter of execution and implementation of existing rules. So I would very like to have also an opinion about, for example, the possibility to change, to modify the modality of election of Human Rights Council. It is viable for both of you. What is your opinion about that? And the third question, I know that I'm taking advantage of my position of moderator, but it is the first time I have that possibility to have so eminent professors answering about so big questions of about around the United Nations. So you will pardon moi if I abuse of my right to ask questions. And the third question I mentioned is about the role of General Assembly. Article 14 of United Nations Charter, since, for example, Professor Bronner mentioned the need to reinvigorate the agency. One way possibly should be reinvigorating General Assembly and its function to mediate, because it is one of important function of General Assembly. So what do you think about that? Article 9, composition of General Assembly. Article 14, function of General Assembly. So mediation of General Assembly between inside a conflict, including an internal conflict, and at the same time, the Human Rights Council composition and reinvigoration, using a term of Professor Bronner, as one of not just political institution, but also civil society institution. Who wants to start?
I'm happy to
Please.
intervene, unless Mehdi would like to say something first. Okay.
Please, go ahead.
Oh, I think, Antonietta, this is viewed a bit too rigidly. I don't think you can run the United Nations without states. But there's going to be a tension within the state in terms of how it defines its national interest. And in that definition, civil society can have a role. Yeah. What you want to do is push for cosmopolitan global politics, such as the Paris agreements on climate change. That tension is not between an organization like the UN and particular nation states. I don't think that can go away. The role of civil society, global in terms domestically, is to push governments to act in a certain way. That's, for example, Black Lives Matter. That's what it's about. You know, on the other hand, global civil society, as Mehdi, I think, correctly pointed out, is there to push the international community. The UN is not composed of saints. The internal structures lead to power clashes. It leads to inefficiency. It leads to all kinds of things. And the weakness of global civil society is shown to the extent that the UN has been more or less independent of it. We have to we have to, if I can put it this way, do 2 or 3 things at once. One, coordinate within global civil society pressure groups or interest groups to push certain politics within the UN. On the other hand, when we need domestic civil society to push national interests or to identify national interests with those of the UN. And that's a complicated enterprise, but it has to be political. One can't, in my view anyway, dissociate civil society from states. I think that's a mistake. As regards the idea of mediation and the roles of people, or the roles of non-governmental organizations in the General Assembly, yes, I think you can, first of all, I believe that NGOs are connected to the UN. ICDD will be connected to the, it's already been agreed, we will be connected to the UN. We will have a type of representative seat, and that will also be the case with UNESCO. The extent to which we make use of it to foster an appropriate climate or to build mediating functions within the UN, that's an open question. We'll see how it works. But I think the mediation also has to be, it can't simply be abstract in terms of the assembly mediating. You can't have 120 odd countries mediating at the same time. There has to be within each mediation, within each reconciliation or civic reconciliation between states, there has to be the stakeholders, the people with interests in those states, whether political officials or civil society, preferably both, have to be involved, in my view. Tensions are unavoidable.
Thank you very much, Stephen. But just before to give back the floor to Professor Zakarin, I just have a doubt. I agree with what you said, but and I love that expression of civil reconciliation. That's the idea, the fundamental idea. Without reconciliation between people, it is impossible to have dialogue to another level. I love that concept, if I can say. But what I would like to ask, in my idea, that's true. The tension is inside a state, every state. So it is of civil society inside the state to push to define the national interest. But is it possible that an international organization, so the voice of civil society from one side over the border of a single state, think, for example, to the movement fighting against the climate change, is outside. So it's outside the border. And at the same time, an institutional, a supranational institution like any agency of United Nations can be, or a special rapporteur of United Nations can be. Do you think that they can, in a circular way, in a certain manner, impact the national discourse,
Yes.
even inside, for example, just you quoted the Black Matter movement. In that case, the impact is on the United States, and at the same time, is a kind of support of that national society in its promotion of values and national interests. So what do you think? Is it possible that circular movement?
Yeah. Martin Luther King, for example, called upon the UN to investigate racism in the United States. That was a remarkable, that was a propagandistic coup for the civil rights movement in the United States. Also in Spain, of course, you had somebody like Henry Kissinger, more or less indicted for war crimes. Again, the problem is the limits that the nation sets on the ability of the UN to intervene. And this is where civil society comes in, global and national, to expand the possibilities of a cosmopolitan politics being pursued.
Okay.
I'm sorry,
Okay.
Matt, if I didn't mean to take your time.
No, no worry. It's always the fault of moderator, so I assume my responsibility. Professor Zakarian, please. It's up to you. Same question. Same questions.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
If you want, I repeat about the composition of General Assembly, at least to the subcommission, applying Article 9 of UN Charter, Article 14 about the function of a General Assembly to mediate in conflict. And please.
About the participation in the General Assembly, it is clear that the representative of the states or the governments, they can participate in the General Assembly. But look, if we have a real estate or we have the states with the people, with the territorial, with the government and with the independence, so this state will represent really the people. So this is the main issue that we should look to that. I mean, for example, what Norway or Switzerland say in the United Nations? They say the interest of the government or the interest of the Norwegian people or the interest of the Switzerland people. What they say? What they say.
You mean, sorry to interrupt you, you mean at level of General Assembly?
Yeah, at the General Assembly. What they say at the General Assembly? I mean, when they talk
but the point, sorry to interrupt you, the point is precisely that, are we sure that the interest represented inside the General Assembly is the interest of people, or is still the representation of state system, so state government, the subject under international law, state apparatus?
The subject is nation. The subject in the United Nations is nation. If you look to the if you look to the Charter of the United Nations, it starts with we the people of the, It starts with this one. It's not saying that we, the states of the different countries, we are going to say something like that or that. So it's represent only the people. But the mistake is that the states that we have in the United Nations, some of them are the despotism or dictatorship government or states. So they cannot be the real states. They are the representative of the government, not an state. An state means people, territorial, government, and independence or sovereignty. So most of them in the General Assembly, they are not presenting the ideas of the peoples. This is the problem of the General Assembly that you asked.
Exactly. So, and in relation to Human Rights Council and the composition of Human Rights Council, and I move to another question right now. for both. In relation to Human Rights Council, what I used to consider as a process still ongoing, if you want, but which is really important, including for the development of the international law per se, in relation to human rights standards and norms. You know that since the creation of Human Rights Council, it has been used a new, or relatively new, if you prefer, form to define the normative substance, and of course also to negotiate a treaty, which is called the Open-Ended Working Group. It has been the case, for example, of the preparation of the text of the optional protocol to the Convention of the Rights of Children of United Nations. The text has been discussed inside the Human Rights Council, but in the framework of a specific working group, Open-Ended Working Group, where I had the privilege to participate to, where everyone has been called to say and to contribute actively to the definition of the text of the treaty, and of course to the substance of the norm. I mean, experts, civil society, and so on. So it is possibly a sort of that kind of instrument internal to the Human Rights Council, because every working group has been always defined inside a resolution adopted by the Human Rights Council. But in your view, Professor Zakarian, it is also a possible way to to advance that process of transformation from state-centered to people-centered of United Nations, and this possibility is also applicable to the General Assembly, so such kind of transformation of mechanism. What do you think?
Maybe, or
In
go ahead.
yeah, please. In the Human Rights Council, the situation is different from the General Assembly, because in the Human Rights Council, we have the role for the NGOs as a advisory for the Human Rights Councils. Even they can run the conference, the debate, even they can present their draft. They can discuss with the member states of the Human Rights Council about the adopting a treaty or pact or covenant. This is possible for the NGOs, for the national committees to come there and to speak. Even in the Human Rights Council, we have the advisory council, which is constituted with the individuals, not with the groups, organizations, or states. They are the independent experts, and they can say their ideas. And also in the human rights bodies of the United Nations, there are the committees. They monitor the application of the Human Rights Treaty by the states. The members of these committees are only individuals. They are experts. They are not the diplomats or the representatives of the states. They are the independent experts. So the situation is totally different. If we go to the General Assembly is more near to the Security Council. So Security Council is totally based on the security, power, peace, threat, war, and if there are a time, they are going to talk about the human rights also, but they are not going to talk on the issue of the human rights, except the security of the great powers is under the threat. So General Assembly also, they rapproche or they try to near to the Security Council, not to the system of the human rights bodies of the United Nations. So because of that, we cannot see any participation by the civil societies in these organs or in the General Assembly. So this is a different. But if we look for the reforms in the General Assembly, what of our ideas or one of our goals could be to recruit the potential of the global civil societies in the General Assembly. This is possible if we wanted to do that.
Okay, thank you. Professor Bronner, it's up to you.
Yes, my dog here is upset because she has to go out, but and she's asleep. But my view is sort of, let's see if we can make this a bit concrete. All of us heard the debate last night between former Vice President Biden and President Trump. One of the sticking points in that debate was these 545 children who were taken from their parents. Now, this should be, in principle, exactly the kind of issue on which the UN should interfere, or the Human Rights Council should interfere. There are a number of reasons why it hasn't. And I'd like to suggest something, which is usually the argument is that it's simply non-Western governments that don't care about the United Nations and also the norms that it generates. I don't think that's right. I think it's the other way around. I think it's precisely the large countries, the powerful countries, in short, the Security Council, that cares very little about these norms. In the United States, I don't know whether this is the case in Iran, but in the United States, foreign policy is unless the United States is directly involved, as in the case of Iraq or Vietnam, foreign policy is almost irrelevant in elections, almost. It's among the lowest issues. You saw last night in the debate, it was barely mentioned. And that's why. What our goal is, I think, as NGOs, is that we have to, in the pursuit of human rights, we have to raise the issue to a basically indifferent public and a skeptical state that this is important. In other words, that there's a legitimacy to the United Nations, and there's a legitimacy towards international, I don't want to say intervention, but certainly, I'll say intervention in issues of human rights and human rights abuses in the states involved. And if I can say so, this is not simply a legal matter, right? This is both political and moral. Norms involve ideals. And one following some of my favorite philosophers, ideals can't simply be realized, but they teach us in some way what to pursue. And that's the case here. we need a different kind of, we have to push a different kind of education rather than simply identity or tradition or the old stuff. What we need is to push, we have to, as another one of my favorite philosophers said, we have to rub history against the grain and raise cosmopolitan issues, cosmopolitan values, cosmopolitan traditions, and teach those, advocate for those. Without that, I fear those 545 children will not see their parents again.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Professor Bronner, for that to underline that important issues, and to mention the reference to those children still waiting to see and embrace their families and parents so long time after.
This is really disgraceful.
Yeah.
And it makes one ashamed of one's country. I mean, just
yeah, but that's the point. It's not a shame, if I may, not upon the country, but it's a shame upon the institution of that country.
yes.
That's the difference we should do, and we should try to also see inside the United Nations. The failure of United Nations sometimes is a failure of institutional or intra-institutional dialogue. Professor Mehdi already mentioned the Security Council, for example.
Agreed.
The current pandemic is, in my view, and I would like to have also your opinion, is also the result of the failure of the functioning of the United Nations Security Council, because just mention the Ebola crisis. With Ebola crisis, United States, firstly, inside the Security Council, called a special meeting of the Council, the Security Council, for the first time in the history of United Nations. A global health crisis has been defined by the Security Council as a threat to peace and international security, obliging all member states of the United Nations to intervene, supporting with human resources, medical resources, and so on, the affected countries by then the epidemic, in order to prevent all the possible level of gravity with the Ebola crisis. So, and you see, it's under the eyes of everyone that it didn't work.
Well, there's no guarantee anything will work. That is I think the wrong question. It's a question of how you try. And with the Ebola crisis, you had a different administration.
Exactly.
And there was a different administration because civil society pushed politics in a different way.
Yeah. But it's in a circular way that what we already said, it's not a legal affair. It's precisely a political and legal at the same time. So that's why law, it's a social science. So it's the rule that society accepts as a rule, as done, accept and feel as mandatory. That's the point. If the link between the society needs and the rule is missed, so we have instability both at internal level and at international level. So I'm interested into the opinion of Professor Mehdi about that point. Please.
Yeah. Question?
I said about the link between the Professor Bronner said already, because you mentioned the Security Council, and I say that inside the Security Council didn't work in that case of pandemic, while into the time of Ebola crisis, yes, it worked, because United States firstly intervened, convening special meeting, extraordinary meeting of the Security Council, and defined the Ebola
But
crisis
Professor
as
Bronner, but Professor Bronner answered to this question.
yeah, and what is
He
your
mentioned
opinion
it
about
very
that?
well. That's the reaction of the civil society in the United States influenced the U.S. administration to demand, to request the members of the Security Council to adopt this resolution about the Ebola. But in the Trump administration, they don't want that, because they don't want to hear the civil society of the United States. So they engage to the other issues. Only they says we want to fight with the terrorism, but they are not going to think about the roots, about the roots of the terrorism. So this is the problem that they have, because when you are going to ask to the civil society how you want to fight the terrorism, they says we should eliminate the roots of the terrorism. For example, poverty, for example, extremism, for example, fanatism, something like that. So, but if you have a very simple strategy, you say, oh, okay, he is a terrorist, I am going to eliminate him, so the problem is finished. But no, the problem will restart again and again. This is the problem that the different administrations they have. And the main problem of the administration, of some administration, is that to not hear to the civil society. This is the real problem that they have.
Eddie, if I can
Please.
say so,
Yeah, please.
you're exactly right. If there is one thing that that makes the Trump administration so noxious, is that it attempts to literally suppress civil society, and it does so by actually an old tactic of fascism, which is to coordinate all the institutions under the president and the president's will and interest. And what you see is, you're completely correct on this, in my view. What you see is a complete disregard, not only for legal norms, but for the basic norms by which America functions. Its constitution also begins, "We the people." But the people have no role here. And it's even symbolically the case because, as you know, President Trump did not win a popular majority. He won an electoral majority, which is very different. He lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton by 3 million votes. That's a lot. And yet he is the president. And he has built on that. That was the first step. He has built on that and celebrated his victory without concerning himself for his defeat in the popular vote. I couldn't agree more with this.
So let me just say that Professor Bronner, I think that we are currently living in a time where no state is exempt from at least a try to silence civil society and the representation of people. I think that in different ways, practically everywhere, it is not total free, and you should just have access to the last published statistics and data from Council of Europe, for example, and other organizations about freedom of speech and the freedom of
But you draw distinctions between regimes, and differences of degree turn into
of
differences
course,
of kind. Differences of
of course,
quantity becomes differences of quality.
of
And
course. But
yeah,
in the substance, in my idea, if the substance is the same, in many cases, you can have the form of a
oh,
democratic regime.
I'm talking about the substance.
Yeah,
If you have a regime, for example, a typical fascist regime, that's going to be qualitatively different, not simply quantitatively different, qualitatively different from a Republican regime. And within Republican regimes, across our border in Canada, there is quite a difference to the United States
yeah.
in terms of all civil liberties and the pandemic, interestingly enough. There's hardly anybody who died in Canada.
Yeah, thank you very much to say that, because you just recalled me to my mind one special phrase that told me to me a few years ago a friend of mine, Mr. Roberto Garreton, that I take that opportunity to say him hello. Who has been a special rapporteur for the human rights situation in Congo, between other things. And one day he told me, listen, are you sure that democratic regime doesn't violate human rights? And he added, a democratic regime, yes, that it does, but in another way.
Indeed.
Simply in another way. So it's not a matter of regime, but it's a matter of way how do a regime violate human rights. And that's the case, for example, of just don't take care of civil society pressure, supprime or repress strongly the voice of civil society and the movements in certain countries, not just in the United States. Think about Brazil, for example.
Of course.
Think about Brazil, and or Ecuador, or other situation, or Nicaragua, and to remain in the American continent. So I think that that's allow us to convene that global, that one challenge that can appear a national one finally is a global challenge.
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah. So, Professor Mehdi.
Yeah.
Going ahead on another point and returning to the mention of non-Western governments and to the Human Rights Council, for example, I'm interested in to know, because you mentioned the Human Rights Council, so what is the role, if there is any role also for those states, non-Western countries, as Professor Bronner defined, into the contribution of, for example, the definition of a content of a right? Is
The
there any
definition
role of
the
a right,
definition,
the normative, the substance of a right? Because
a lot,
of course,
a
a
lot.
substance, they cannot, you mean?
I didn't say that. I said a lot,
sorry.
many. That they have many role on the definition of the human rights terms. For example, look, the Western countries, they created the first generations of human rights. The first generation of human rights is political and civil rights. And this is not true to look only in the first generation, or only to the second generation, or only to the third generation. But the problem was that when they started to write the human rights declarations, at that moment in 48, they didn't write anything about the environment, about the climate change, about the issue like that. So the non-Western countries, especially the non-developed countries in Africa, they added this subject and these issues to the human rights issues. So this is their role, to add something different from the view of the Western countries. Unfortunately, when I thought in the Western universities, my students, they thought only they can find human rights only in the Western countries, but this is not true, because the Western countries, they centered only on the political and civil rights. But at the beginning, I mean, not actually, because actually the North European country, they insist and they follow the issue of the third generations of human rights. Anyway, I want to say that the role of the non-Western countries was and is important on the human rights issues, which is different from the views of the Western countries. And for example, in this moment, we have a lot of challenge and we have a lot of problem on the new issues of human rights. And these issues is created by non-Western countries today, I mean. So for this end, I think they have an important role.
And but you mentioned new challenges, new exigencies of protection, new situation like climate change, and of course the contribution is it's under no discussion. But do you think that they also contributed to the definition of existing rights, or, as you said, the first category, let me use that term, including the rights included inside the Universal Declaration in a specific historical time, because you mentioned it was 1948. So the situation of the world and the organization of states were another one. So the relationship between states were others of another kind. So do you think that third countries also contributed with their differences, traditions, cultural tradition, legal tradition, to modify or clarify, including the content of existing rights?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. I mentioned that they presented the issues of the environment, of the climate change, of the development.
But those are new ones.
Right to peace. The right
but those
to
are
peace.
New ones. But those are new ones. Think, for example, about the concept of freedom of religion, which is an historical freedom for everyone.
Yeah, this is the problem that the Western countries they have. They normally they repeat the issue of the freedom of the religion, but never they look to the respect or to recognize the religion the people they have. This is another thing that in the non-Western countries
inside the United Nations,
because in the non-Western countries, the people, they are very sensible about their beliefs, about their faith, about their religion. So if you talk about the freedom of the religion, they think that you want to ask them to change their religion.
No.
This is the different of the view. Me, I understand what you mean.
No. Stay, please. Please stay inside the Human Rights Council. Stay inside the Human Rights Council, because the report that the Human Rights Council did.
that's the difference. When you talk about the east side of the Human Rights Council, at that place only the states they talk about the human rights. But me, as a member of the society, I talk with you, and I say what will happens in the society when you talk about the freedom of the religion. That one is different because they look to the interest of the government, and then the governments at the Human Rights Council, they will say their position about the issue.
I think that, if I may, that in my view, and I wrote about that topic because where a single state couldn't do anything, yes, the Human Rights Council did. They needed 10 years of discussion, negotiation, and so on, but grateful to the Human Rights Council, there have been a very big, in my view, progress about the content and the definition of the substance of the right and the relevance of the right. There are a lot of resolution of the Human Rights Council since firstly of the Human Rights Commission, I would like to say, since 2000. And then, but especially from Human Rights Council. And in my idea, that's why I'm not so much critic with the Human Rights Council, because I see a potential into the Human Rights Council of reconciliation, including of civil society inside that, because they reach a very big not agreement, but a step ahead, something better into definition of the right.
See,
I agree.
I don't think that's true, Antonio.
Why, Professor?
Because the basic principles aren't laid out. You have to decide straight up. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with Mehdi on this. You have to decide, first of all, is there what Jefferson called a wall of separation between public and private, between the state and religion. The second
But
thing
that's the
is
work. That's the work.
Wait.
Sorry.
The second thing is it's a very simple claim. The issue isn't whether you have absolutist religions or dogmatic religions. The issue is, will the person in the absolutist religion recognize the right of another absolutist to exist at the same time? As soon as you do that, you move the question outside of religion itself, and you move it into the liberal rule of law. Secondly, if that's true, if one doesn't have the liberal rule of law operative, then within any religion, what happens to the heretic? What happens to the person who speaks, whether as a Jew or as a Muslim or as a Christian? What happens to the person who says to the Orthodox organizations, I don't believe it, you're doing it wrong, it should be done differently? Do they have the right to repress him in the name of the religion, or don't they? These are I think there's been far too much deflection and far too much avoiding the real issues on freedom of religion within the council. And in my view, it's up to NGOs to make that clear.
And they did it. That's what I'm trying to say. That's
that's not what I said.
The inside the Human Rights Council, because we must distinguish, in my view, we should distinguish between what a single state do and what the United inside and outside about the same issue. So inside the Human Rights Council, and I had the chance to attend personally on that kind of meeting, the advancement we have is that there has been of course, we need also still step forward, but we advanced in the idea that how do you say that freedom is related to people and not to an abstract concept, and that the contribution of United Nations did inside the Human Rights Council. Because of that, returning to human right to Western countries, let me just give you an example. Because of the resolutions, which is resolutions of Human Rights Council are not mandatory from a legal point of view, but United Kingdom, for example, if rightly remember, modified the internal law regulating freedom of speech in order to prevent, so eliminated blasphemy law in order to protect religious freedom from hate speech.
That's
As a consequence of the work of the Human Rights Council, and inside the Human Rights Council, the multicultural negotiation coming especially from non-Western country, from third countries, so countries new into the Human Rights Council.
Yeah, I'm afraid I disagree with this whole line of argument. The idea of freedom of religion, the attack on blasphemy, this is in the English tradition. This goes back 350 years. This is Hobbes and Locke, who actually laid out what I was just saying before. The second thing is the idea of freedom being the freedom of the people. I think that's the wrong definition. This is shows.
Oh, from an individual freedom. I meant, sorry.
Yeah, I think that's the wrong way to proceed. This is from the idea that democracy equals the majority, so to speak. Freedom is the freedom of the person who thinks differently. Democracy is the recognition of the minority. It's
of
not,
course.
The rest is a purely formal exercise. That willingness is, in my view, what I said with freedom is the freedom of the one who thinks differently. That comes from Rosa Luxemburg, one of my old heroes, the great revolutionary of the early 20th century. The issue is the extent to which that idea of dissidence is allowed. And you can see within even the English way of talking about it, it's precisely the dissident who, for John Locke, is the incarnation of freedom. It's very interesting. This is a step back by the English government, not a step forward. You already had the imperative, and you not only have the imperative, but you had it socialized. This is part of the civil society.
I understand your view. From a certain point, it can be considered for UK, for example, a step back. But in another view, it can be considered as a step ahead because there was no regulation of hate speech, for example, in UK, but yes, regulation about blasphemy. So it was used, like in many countries, including non-Western, as a tool to stabilize the power. You know, blasphemy has always utilized for that. So that's why the Human Rights Council, in a certain way, in my view, and as I have the opportunity to to write somewhere, it has been important in that way to clarify or to try to clarify those differences and to find a common understanding between different traditions, cultures, and uh, to clarify the substance of a right. So that's I think that we can have another webinar only on that point, but the idea, the initial idea is to underline the role of United Nations about resolving, or the impact that United Nations can have in resolving conflict of definition of a right, including within the institution. Professor Mehdi mentioned the Human Rights Council, and that's why I mentioned the role that the Human Rights Council had, at least in general terms, in that definition. So one more question I would like to, I don't want to take advantage and abuse of your passions.
No.
And I have a lot of questions because it's
But please look
something.
to the time because
Yeah, I know. So just one more question for both of you, if I can. It is related to the role of the role of UN agencies. Both of you mentioned did reference to the agencies, and you know that the current pandemic, to remain in the present time, has been under the responsibility, in particular, of the WHO, the World Health Organization. So, in your view, and according to what we said, already said, how is it possible to be to have more impactful agencies of United Nations? In the case of education, for example, UNESCO. In the case of children's rights, UNICEF. Is it, for example, viable to create an interagency mechanism of coordination? What do you think,
Mehdi?
Professor Mehdi?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, please let me to explain more about the issue of the freedom of religion that Professor Brunner, my dear colleague, he explained more about this one. I agree with him totally about the definition of the freedom of religion. We cannot say that, for example, freedom of religion is not necessary for world or for some countries. Every country need to that. But something is more important, Professor Brunner. What is important is that to have the tolerance. If we have the tolerance, we can accept the other people to follow the other religion. The main problem in the Middle East, or at least in some country in the Middle East, the people, they forgot the issue of the tolerance. So they become, so they become very resistant about the freedom of the religion, and then they cannot accept this one. But me, because I live with the people, with the students, that they have the different ideas from the freedom of religion, I mention it and I repeat here that if we are going to promote the freedom of a religion as a policy from the Western countries to convince the people in the Middle East to accept their right to change the religion, they will be more extremist about this issue. This is very important. I wanted also to say that when we talk about the freedom of the religion, we should insist about the respect to the religions also. If not, freedom of the religion will not be accepted among these peoples. They will be very, very strong about this idea and this issue. But about your question about the agencies, you know, these agencies like UNICEF or WHO or other countries, or excuse me, other agencies, they have a big problem for promoting their ideas. And the problem is their budget. The budget of UNESCO and the WHO is very related to the states members. So, for example, when I talk or when I promote the issue of the multilateralism, and then I cannot fund the UNICEF or WHO or UNRWA, they will collapse. This is the reality. So I think this is the problem that they should think about this one. About the UNICEF, the situation is very different because UNICEF had a thought to find the fund for themselves by publishing the card postals, by buying or, excuse me, selling something for kids like the puppets or puppets or the things for the students, so they can find some funds. But the other agencies like UNRWA, they don't have any fundraising. So they look only to the hand of the United States or big countries like Japan, Germany, China to send the money to them. So if I conclude about this question, I should say that the main problem of these agencies is the fundraising.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Bronner, you would like to add something else about that point?
Just very quickly. I did a book on the Enlightenment, and one of the bases for that book was, I'm sorry, I lost you here, was John Locke's Letter on Toleration. This was a crucial issue in the development of the West, which, by the way, is not accepted by a lot of people, as you can see with Trump, and as you can see with the far right, and as you can see with fascism and so on. Now, one of the things I learned, because it wasn't taught in schools, was how Turkey had its own enlightenment. And one of my graduate students did a dissertation on the Chinese Enlightenment. And one can find, of course, within the Middle East, a marvelous tradition of toleration and liberalism, or liberal ideas. I think you're quite right that there is a reaction whenever one tries to push a, shall we say, a more tolerant kind of politics of religion. But that's not unique to the Middle East. That exists here too. There is going to be there will always be a kind of, well, not always, but one of the things that modernity has done is generate the reaction to it. The toleration of different religions is going to produce fundamentalism. I don't think that matters very much whether it's the West or the East. It's just you don't see it in the United States the same way. It takes a different form. But for example, our new Supreme Court justice, this is a tragedy that's taking place. Not simply because the Supreme Court has moved to the right, but because we now have explicitly the intrusion of religion into politics. What I couldn't agree more with your basic idea of toleration, but we have to see that even with two things, even within Western nations, certainly within the Eastern, their traditions in conflict. We have to choose which tradition. Are we going to choose, for example, in the Middle East, are we going to choose the tradition of Avicenna and Averroes and Al-Farabi? Or are we going to choose the tradition of Osama or bin Laden or Hassan Turabi? That's a choice within the same traditions. There are tensions, and there are.
I think that if I can, Professor Bronner, I think it's not a matter of choice.
Why?
Let me quote Aristotle. I think that if we learn, and I modify the phrase of Aristotle, if we learn about the others, we can understand the other without being obliged to accept the different idea. So we respect the different idea.
No, but there are going to be people in the society who don't agree with you, Antonietta, within the same tradition, within the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Oh, okay, I understand your point. I'm just saying something else.
Yeah, and you as a person have the right to, you should have the right, and you have the ability to choose, for example, am I going to be an Orthodox Jewish settler, or am I going to be critical of that? Am I going to be a Christian, a Catholic like the Berrigan brothers, or a Protestant like Martin Luther King? Or am I going to be an evangelical lunatic? You can choose that. But
yeah,
right, you have to have the educational opportunities.
We are actually saying the same.
Yeah.
If you learn, that's the point. Education, and that's what Aristotle said.
Yeah, but we have to teach that. We have to
we have to learn about others to have the right to choose. That's the basic idea under every human right.
Yeah,
if I don't learn about about the fact that I have the right to move freely around the state, I will never move ahead. That's the point. So the basic idea is not only related to freedom to choose a religion or another one. It's the idea of freedom per se. I want to say, if I learn, if I can have access to education, if I can empower myself, I know my rights, I can defend my rights. Yeah. That's the idea. So I think that we say practically the same, but in another way. I take the freedom to say that. So
see, Khaled has entered the scene. Are you?
Yeah, Khaled is also here with us, Mr. Hassan. And I think that I don't see everyone in my screen, but I see that we have Dr. Stefania Tolini also from University of Salento, Italy. And I don't see, I'm sorry if I don't mention the other one, but I don't have the complete screen, unfortunately. So I have a lot of questions for you, but I know that the time is going ahead, and I don't want to abuse of your patience and availability to be with us today. and with me, because I'm learning a lot, and I'm very grateful to both of you for that. And I have just another one question, a last one, and then if you agree, we will try to open the floor to the audience for additional questions to all of you. My last question is just give me in few words what it means right to development, which is one of the flag of United Nations, one of the most important challenge in my view of United Nations. What is to you, Professor Brenner and Bronner, sorry, and Professor Mehdi, right to development? What does it mean for you? Please, you have the floor. Professor Mehdi,
Right.
would you start?
No. Yeah. Very briefly, right to change. When we talk about the right to development, it means right to change. Right to change, I mean the better life. The better life, sometimes the people, they think that it means only industrialization of the country. It means the right to development. But when you think only on the industrialization of the country, you are going to forget the other thing, which is the bad result of the right of the development. For example, right to development, I mean industrializations happened a lot of things against the environment. But when we say right to development mean right to change to a better life, it means that you can have the better life with respecting to the environment, with respecting to the other people, and etc. etc. That's my definition.
Thank you very much. Very nice definition. Professor Bronner, you have the floor, please.
I don't think I can say more than Mehdi said. One of our Nobel Prize winners, Amartya Sen, spoke about development. It was a breakthrough in the social sciences. He said that what development really is as Mehdi says, an ability to have a fuller and richer and more diverse and more open society, which comes down to, I think that's very well put, the right to change, the right to think differently. And actually, I think back on one philosopher's way of saying it, a generation can set up barriers to the ability of the next generation to change. And I think that's, I think Mehdi said this very well.
Thank you very much to both of you. So before to conclude, I would just to open the floor to the public. If someone would like to intervene, you have the choice to write your question in the chat, or just to open your microphone and ask the question directly and intervene.
No one should be shy.
No question. Good.
I think that yes, we have Mr. Khaled Hassan. I guess yes, I'm
Yes.
right. Oh,
Yes.
welcome. Thank
Okay.
you to be with us today and to follow us. So please ask your question. You have the floor, but 2 minutes to ask your question in order to give to the speakers the possibility to give their view. Please.
Okay, thank you for this nice dialogue, and thank you for your that you allow me to ask. My question is also from my experience when I discuss with our people or a lot of people from Middle East, they don't trust and they don't believe in the UN. And also, that's because a lot of intervention of the UN in the Middle East, it has, if we talk about politics and the armed conflicts, not from the side of the human rights. The UN wasn't success. And the UN also just worked, as they said, and they work. UN worked for the interests of the powerful countries, or the interests of the countries who they finance the UN. My question is, how could we reform? How could we reform the UN behavior? And also, how could be how could the UN work without the influence of those powerful countries?
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's clear for you, for all of you, the question. Professor Bronner and Mehdi, yeah? So, Professor Mehdi, would you like to answer?
Yeah. I remember the explanation of the Kofi Annan about the role of the United Nations. The late Secretary General Kofi Annan, he said that we are the staffs of the states. We are not the staff of the United Nations. So when the states decide to do that, we will do that. To change our policy, we change our policy. So as you see, United Nations staff and United Nations in the different countries, they implement only the policy of the policies that states approved in the United Nations. They cannot do the things different from the strategies which was approved by the states. So if we want to change their behavior, only we can intervene by the states, and the states should ask them to change their behavior.
Thank you very much, Professor Bronner. You have the floor.
Yeah, I basically agree with Mehdi. It seems to me that, again, it's a twofold operation. On the one hand, I think we have to build global civil society. For example, for Yemen, one of the ways in which to proceed would be to put the Houthi problem in front of the UN. If we're lucky and we have global pressure, maybe a few steps can be taken. At the same time, as one does that, one has to build a consciousness, a cosmopolitan consciousness within one's own country, so that we can get the right administration to help build a cosmopolitan politics. The difference between, for example, the difference between President Obama and President Trump here is radical. It's almost like you have two countries, and I think it's true. You virtually have a civil war in the United States over this. It's not as violent as the old Civil War, but ideologically, it's just as fierce. And what we have to do, I think all of us, if we're going to build the United Nations for the future, we have to build that cosmopolitan tolerance, as using Mehdi's term, within our own states and within the global community at the same time. Then we could slowly, within the General Assembly, put pressure on the Security Council to change and move one way or the other. Yeah.
Thank you very much also for that important point, Professor Bronner. And actually, if I can add just something is in relation to respect. That's the point, and that's why it's important to reshape a multilateralism, but from from down to the top,
Yes.
if you want, because the failure of multilateralism and to the level of intergovernmental relationships is possibly due to the fact that the most important principle, the respect, the mutual respect between states, has been has been forgotten definitively. There's no respect between states. So under international law, but not just under international law, it's a basic principle. No, parim parem non habet judicium. So every state should be considered on the same level, despite the economic budget and so on. So that's why it's increasingly important to have a dialogue and not just a conversation, a dialogue, and through the dialogue and integration between civil society to build the cosmopolitan society you mentioned, and I subscribe. So any other question from the audience? I'm not sure. Someone else? I don't see. Mr. Hassan, did you request the floor again? I'm not sure. No. Okay. So just so before to conclude, I don't know if you, Professor Bronner and Professor Mehdi, would you like to add any conclusion before to conclude that session? Professor Mehdi, few words of wishes to United Nations at least. After
I respect your conclusion.
Yes.
Thank you. So I feel today I can say at the end of that session that let me say something personal, if I can. I feel like a child when you give to him I don't know, a piece of cake. So I feel the same level of happiness today, grateful to Professor Mehdi and Professor Bronner and that intensive conversation that I'm absolutely sure will improve not only the way and the strengthening and the process toward an integrated civil society, but also a development of dialogue and conversation, and it would be also a contribution to the development of international legal order in general terms.
I just want to thank you, and we should extend our thanks to you for organizing this conference or this dialogue, and for your passion and your commitment and your wonderful values. And so
thank you very much. Thank you very much for saying that. And so, you know, after all, if United Nations doesn't work well, we need to make more additional efforts to adjust it, to arrange it and say, oh, yeah, now it works well. So in that occasion, I would like to say that if something is apparently not probable, is always possible. So to me, it's possible to have a stronger United Nations, a stronger system of international institution with a more impactful intervention of civil society. And that's the very big example we have today. That said, I wish to United Nations happy birthday, happy 75th birthday.
Oh, that's very nice.
And I give you meeting to another session in the near future, I hope, with both Professor Mendy and Professor Bronner. Bye-bye.